All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going to be examining some of the things going on with our current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, a former head of the CIA. Now, I don't know if I'm going out on a limb here, but I get a little bit skeptical about people who have connections to the CIA in general. And I think that some of this stems from kind of a lot of what we learned about during the Reagan Bush years, mostly emphasis on George H.W. Bush, who was a former head of the CIA. And if I recall, Bush was the only former head of the CIA to go on to become president. But if we want to sort of look at our current Secretary of State, I mean, the first thing to say is that Mike Pompeo was not in the CIA for that long. And I was listening to a speech from him recently, and I really began to notice that Mike Pompeo was somebody who just really seemed to just load his platform with just ordinary political talking points that you could hear about on any sort of talk radio program or in any of those newsletters that you would receive. And I think that that stems from his time in Congress, serving in the 4th Congressional District for the state of Kansas. We're talking about the House of Representatives here. Now, is it good to have someone who is just kind of a talking point centered individual running the CIA and then the State Department as the Secretary of State? In theory, I want to say no, but to give a very nonpartisan statement, apparently he's been very loyal to Donald Trump, and, well, I mean, loyalty is something when you're making appointments, so once again, in a nonpartisan way, there is that, and that's something that might actually be somewhat of a good choice. But when you actually want to look at what's going on, this is one of the things that I just have to put out there. My own sort of initial observation about why Mike Pompeo became our Secretary of State was that it was all planned from the beginning. Rex Tillerson was, of course, Donald Trump's first Secretary of State, and as well as having his first two national security advisors being Michael Flynn for a little while, right, and then H.R. McMaster, who actually served for almost 2 years. And I thought this was planned from the beginning, that the whole time the plan was supposed to be Mike Pompeo was going to be Secretary of State and John Bolton was going to be National Security Advisor, because then you would have CIA plus neoconservatism. And John Bolton isn't just an ordinary neocon, he is probably the biggest warmonger in the entire government. And that is how you get to these situations like Venezuela. Like, I mean, people online were talking about Venezuela back in 2017, trying to say things like, I mean, to the credit of people like Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams and Chris Rosini, they were talking about this back in 2017 that they were going to be going after Venezuela in terms of what they refer to as starting a war, but it actually seems more like a method of destabilization. Was my little theory correct that they just didn't want Pompeo and Bolton to be the first two members to be Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor because it would have received an enormous amount of backlash by putting in first Rex Tillerson to kind of rig the system for big oil, and then H.R. McMaster, who has been accused multiple times of serving for the deep state. So you have kind of just like one person representing massive corporate entities and another person representing a single big industry, that being big oil. Rex Tillerson, of course, with big oil, H.R. McMaster with some sort of other corporate entity, most notably the mega banks. And that these guys were there to serve their role, and then they actually the real two people that were supposed to be in power were going to be Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. That this was all planned from the beginning. I can say though, why I don't know if my kind of initial suspicion was completely wrong. I would say that many other people are not going down that road. I tried to discuss this with several people on forums. They didn't really seem to keep an open mind. And this is something that we've talked about many times when we deal with true crime cases on this channel. It's just like if something really isn't gaining traction, sometimes you need to rework your theory or you need to examine your theory in a different light. When it comes to somebody like Mike Pompeo, though, I am very skeptical and almost distrustful of the sort of kind of anyone who has any sort of connection to the CIA and then rises in power, such as what we said at the beginning about the way that George H.W. Bush did. And Mike Pompeo was not CIA director for very long. I mean, he was at the beginning of the Trump administration, only to, and he left the CIA midway through the Trump administration. And once again, it seems like Donald Trump did appoint him out of loyalty, but I also get somewhat skeptical about the kind of larger plans that could be at play. Or I should say, I'm rather suspicious as opposed to skeptical. When you want to look back at somebody such as George H.W. Bush, it's like George H.W. Bush was somebody who really just pulled in a lot of chaos during the Reagan Bush era. And it's like the CIA is something that really does lead to a large amount of international calamity. When we want to look at Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran, I mean, they don't even try to hide that anymore. The CIA participated in a coup to take out Mohammed Mossadegh because he wanted the sort of natural resource profits to go to his country as opposed to Anglo-Iranian oil or whatever the name of that company was, into outside entities that were trying to get all of the wealth from the natural resources. Very big nutshell version. I know you can call me out on anything you want there, but okay, so they took out Mossadegh in Iran. They took out Salvador Allende in Chile because they were just like, democracy is too slow to take its course. Not to mention the destabilization of Chad. These are things that the CIA does. And someone once asked me, like, would you ever want to work with the CIA? And I was like, no, they kill people. There used to be this documentary on Netflix. I think it was just called Dark Secrets of the CIA. But I was looking for that, and I couldn't find the exact one that I saw. But they had this one guy in there who just said that while he was working for the CIA, part of his duty was to poison the milk supply for a school cafeteria in Chile, poisoning children. It's like, no, I don't want to work for the CIA. They do some really destructive things. And if that stuff is all true, once again, sometimes people do just try to get their names out there to sell books and such. What I can say about that documentary though is it was based on Ralph McGee's book Deadly Deceit, one of the expose CIA tell-all books. Although Ralph McGee wasn't the person who was presenting that story about the children and the poisoned milk in the cafeteria. That was some other guy, but they introduced it, presenting once again the book Deadly Deceit by Ralph McGee. And some of the other books about the CIA would be In Search of Enemies, is perhaps the most famous one by John Stockwell, and he also wrote The Praetorian Guard, which was a compilation of his like lectures and notes and essays and various things. That might even be flying drugs up from Central America. The whole thing's about George H.W. Bush and Manuel Noriega and like creating a fake war on drugs or something. Front lines, guns, drugs, and the CIA. That program that sort of exposed the whole thing. And a lot of it sounded like Alex Jones. A lot of it sounded like InfoWars. And I was just like, is this stuff really true? Even that guy I mentioned, John Stockwell, who's revealing all these things about the CIA, was he really telling the truth? And even like more than a Google search to learn that the CIA sued him for writing the tell-all book, so it seems like there's a certain degree of truth. Not to mention, he actually did have somewhat of an academic argument. Whereas there are other people who have revealed things about the CIA, such as Kevin Shipp, who has lectures on YouTube as well. He has mentioned, like, I mean, I don't know if he actually was using that as kind of his source material, but to me it seemed very similar, especially when he talks about the sort of mechanism, or more likely the mechanics of who is involved with like the deep state and so on. I mean, it seemed very, very similar. But when we want to get back to Mike Pompeo, I'm not very trustful of our politicians, and I'm not very trustful of our world leaders. And as somebody once said, even here on YouTube, they were just kind of like, if someone wants to enter politics, they have a certain urge and lust for power. So doesn't that make you just the slightest bit distrustful to begin with? And one of the things that we can look for with the CIA is that, I mean, I'm about to say introduce kind of a larger, genuine conspiracy theory that I don't completely subscribe to. And that would be that this comes to us from like the Tax Wall Street Party, the United Front Against Austerity, when they sort of just made the claim that the CIA is the working arm of elites. Or in other words, we could talk about it this way. We could say that there are three by Chris Wallace. It was called Clinton Kicks the Crap Out of Fox News, and he even talked about in that one he wanted to get Bin Laden, but the CIA refused to certify basing rights in the kind of northern Islamic Republic, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan, so they couldn't get basing rights, and then Bill Clinton wasn't able to get Bin Laden in the way that they so desired. And I was like, you're the president of the United States and you can't command the CIA to do what you want? Well, is this something where it's like the CIA phone? That's kind of just something that I think in the general like we don't necessarily know too much about. What would be the motivation to kind of have something where like Mike Pompeo would be kind of waiting in the wings or something? Why put him as CIA director first? Well, I mean, I think it was part of like a bigger plan. Like, why put him as CIA director first and then Secretary of State? If my kind of initial suspicion is true, it's because it's kind of just the sort of consequences inefficient and poorly run system that is dealing with the destabilization of nations, partially for profit, partially because of just kind of poorly run political operations. I mean, someone broke it down that way once when they said the military industrial complex is not a grand calculated conspiracy. They're not these people sitting around the table saying, hey, why don't we destroy this country so that we'll get rich? They're like saying, no, it's not like that. It's just these are the consequences of these inefficient systems. I mean, yes, there is a very large arms industry. Yes, people do make billions of dollars. And even by 1980, the arms industry became the second largest industry in the world. And then they had the enormous peacetime buildup during the Reagan administration. But I mean, then there was all sort of other. They called it a peacetime buildup, but the United States was involved with so many other problems during the Reagan Bush era. I mean, we're going to be talking about, I mean, whether it's Noriega in Panama or you have something like, Iran-Contra, for example. How about that one? George H.W. Bush attended 17 meetings on Iran-Contra, and then when he was asked about stuff by the reporters, he would just, every single time, just said, I don't recall. It's like, I mean, the United States was participating in a lot of very, very distasteful activities, not to mention training members of the DDS, the sort of special forces for Chad that just brutalized the country, like they were involved with torturing and, I mean, what Dick Cheney would call enhanced interrogation techniques, except much worse. They were the kind of people that would strap people's faces to car exhaust pipes and then, just run the smoke down their throats and stuff. And that's kind of detailed more in the film Talking About Rose. They kind of deal more about what happened with the CIA in Chad and the installation of the Albright regime in Chad. And that was one of the earlier things that happened in the Reagan administration. So the CIA is up to a lot. They're never really up to much good. Or I mean, I guess I spoke too soon. I guess there's always the possibility that they are up to no good. I mean, once again, they have done some things like rescuing hostages and so on. So I can't say that they are all bad. And this is one of the large areas that we find in government. We find that it's just kind of a nasty world, and that sometimes people have to do things that are less than desirable. One of the things, though, that I did experience after putting forward my initial theory that kind of this kind of larger grand scheme that the sort of military industrial complex wanted to destabilize nations, so they wanted Pompeo and Bolton in there as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. I began to become a little skeptical about my own theory, a little bit doubtful about my own theory, when I was reading the Bob Woodward book, Fear, Trump in the White House, commonly just referred to as the Bob Woodward book. But I mean, I love how we can just say that. We know exactly what we're talking about. But when we want to look at that particular book, like if what Bob Woodward was writing about had any degree of truth, he was sort of saying that what really happened with the Secretary of State position was Rex Tillerson and former Secretary of Defense James Mattis formed an alliance. They thought Trump was incompetent, so they just decided that they were going to be doing things on their own way. They had like weekly meetings together. I believe it was on Sunday nights because they they weren't too far from what well they had meetings on Sunday nights. They got together. They kind of like conferenced about what to do, and they're just like, "Hey, we're just gonna go on our own. We're not gonna be listening to Trump." And it was actually H.R. McMaster who was opposed to the concept of just going rogue and just what they called circumventing the president. It was H.R. McMaster who was opposed to all that. So I do have to confess, though, that a lot of that sort of deep state conspiracy stuff was really spread about H.R. McMaster by none other than InfoWars. They'd had a huge presentation on McMaster and the deep state that got taken down because of the deplatforming. But when you want to look at what's going on with Mattis and Tillerson, I mean, as far as I understand, it really seems like Tillerson, we're talking about Rex Tillerson, former CEO of Exxon, former Secretary of State, was pretty much fired because he was kind of just going about things in somewhat of a disloyal way. So that would be kind of a clearer motivation for Trump to install Mike Pompeo, someone who had a higher record of loyalty, even though he is somewhat of a talking point politician who just sounds like he could have been a Kansas radio host or he could be the Secretary of State. You couldn't really tell the difference. It's like I don't necessarily know if like that is the best image, but once again, if you're going to be just thinking about someone who has this strong record of loyalty for you, I can't really condemn the president too much for that particular decision. When you want to kind of look at this though, I mean, I still have to insist though, I am distrustful of people who have had connections to the CIA and have risen in power. Am I going too far out on a limb with that? I don't really think so, because to actually get to the level of where Mike Pompeo was, you have to have a certain sense of being able to manipulate the system and also working with these dreaded powerful entities that do comprise the military industrial complex, that do comprise these things called the deep state. And once again, we're not talking about people sitting around a table trying to destroy nations for their own sick psychotic reasons and sell money. Okay, tomorrow we're going to destroy Venezuela and we're all going to get rich. I no, I mean I've really one of the things that I've just gathered over the years is the deep state and the military industrial complex do not function like that. It's like very very uncalculated, but there are just consequences to the actions of large level arms sales. There are consequences to the actions of large level big oil transactions, even. And all of these things can kind of push people down. And you're dealing with people who are solely trying to profit from these industries, whether it is the arms industries, whether it is big oil, whether it is even things like the mega banks. I mean, there are kind of unintended consequences that are horrendously disastrous. Or there are even just sort of some intended consequences that could be some things where it's like they want to get rid of a certain political leader because the person is just kind of a cog in the machine, because this person is kind of just not cooperating with US policy. And that's what happened in the examples that we've given. Iran, Chad, Chile, and then we've mentioned also a little bit about Manuel Noriega in Panama and his connections to George H.W. Bush, but that situation is a little different than Chad, Chile, and Iran. But the whole point is, I mean, the United States government does have a history of trying to manipulate the affairs of other nations for the benefit of their own foreign policy. This is why so many people are talking about non-interventionism. This is why so many people are talking about just ending these wars, ending that stuff about being the policeman of the world, because it's like they're recognizing that other millions upon millions of people are caught in the crossfire and dying just to further this sort of empire style policy tactics. But from our own former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, it's just like sometimes there are less than desirable conditions, sometimes there are less than desirable allies that a president is forced to work with. And we do have to respond to certain things, and it's really just kind of a difference in philosophy. I mean, I don't know how much the neocons actually believe what they're saying, where it's like you kind of launch a small military conflict to prevent a world war from happening, or that the only way to preserve democracy is by going to war, hence why so many people are sickened by John Bolton, because he, once again, perhaps the largest warmonger in the government. I do insist, though, there would have been an enormous backlash if Donald Trump had hired John Bolton as his first national security advisor. And it's like, there might have even been some backlash if he had hired Mike Pompeo straight, from the House of Representatives to be Secretary of State. Maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, it's like, not really too sure about that particular one, but John Bolton definitely. He was not very well liked by anyone then, and he's still not very well liked by many people across the board. But to actually look at where we are now with the CIA and with the sort of situation with American foreign policy, I would say that the theory that I put forward initially had a few holes in it that I didn't anticipate. And maybe it's not exactly so much that it was a gross calculated effort to sneak in ahead of the CIA and a warmongering neocon into Trump's cabinet. I think that that could sort of be half true now. What I would say is the larger, and this is a more mundane point, it's that the economically weaker nations are bearing the full frontal of the political drama from economically stronger nations. Look at something like Yemen, where you have the pro Saudi side and the pro Iranian side, yet they're fighting in Yemen. Yemen is the nation being brutalized. The fighting isn't happening in Saudi Arabia, they're pushing the violence into Yemen. Or, this is also a controversial statement, but the United States and Russia, when it comes to empire style politics, they're duking it out in Syria. I mean, some people say that that's the whole reason why there is a military conflict in Syria. It was because the United States wanted to stop the Russian influence in the Middle East. They wanted to kind of destabilize Russia's largest ally in the Middle East so they couldn't start building up bases across the Middle East, and they just had to shut them down where with their strongest ally being Syria. And I mean, when you just read stuff on the internet, I'm not former CIA, I'm not even an academic, you do read a lot of people talking about that stuff. And once you sort of notice that pattern of consistency, that's when I just began to notice that economically weaker nations are bearing the full frontal of violence from the economically stronger nations. And even a larger thing going on in Somalia. Why is there still so much violence in Somalia? Is it just because they can't get their act together? That might be a little bit of it, but also the CIA was heavily involved in Mogadishu. There's an even entire second Guantanamo Bay in Mogadishu, where this is all detailed in Jeremy Scahill's article from The Nation. And I know some people are not really big fans of Jeremy Scahill. Other people think he's like mega insightful, but I mean, he wrote kind of an expose on the CIA's operations in Mogadishu, Somalia. Once again, Scahill wrote an article for The Nation, and you can find that all online for free. It's like if you ever want to do any more reading up on the subject. Is there actually a grand calculated move that was going on part of the military industrial complex in the deep state to force a head of the CIA and a warmongering neocon into Trump's cabinet kind of inconspicuously? I'd say that it's probably half true because once you sort of learn that life is kind of interlocking and there are all sorts of kind of connected political forces about, and there's also something called the political climate. I remember, like, just like listening to an interview with someone back in 1997, and they were like, the government doesn't even really create a policy. The political climate creates a policy. You have to respond to all these different changes, like here and there, and you just, there's like, this uprising in this country that's putting pressure on this military base, and then, like, there also this kind of internal movement that's happening in your own nation. All of these changes that you have to respond to, the political climate just sorts itself out. So I definitely think that it is somewhat true that a former head of the CIA, Pompeo, and a warmongering neocon, John Bolton, ended up in the positions that they did. The question is just how calculated was it? It almost doesn't matter at this point. What we really can say is that there are sort of consequences to the political climate that we live in that is also pushed away forward, where the CIA, which seeks to extend the sort of empire style politics around the world, and the warmongering neocons who kind of benefit from war in general, because not only does it increase more power for America, it creates more profit for the arms industry, military industrial complex. So I hope that can be kind of the conclusion of where we are in this very long and twisted podcast rant. Bear in mind that everything I said is just kind of theoretical, hypothesizing, and my own personal take on the subject. What do you have